Hello, in this video I want to talk a little bit more about abolition and worker strike. This might end up being the last video in this series. I'm not really sure, depending on whether or not I kind of decide to sketch out some other portions of what this kind of looks like for the upcoming LD resolution and just in like debates in general. But I definitely want to make this video to at least finish out the series for now, to kind of round it out talking and ending the series that we started in the last video, talking a little bit about like what responses to abolition affirmatives on the workers' strike resolution can really look like. I definitely, like I said in the last video, I think this is a really important topic to talk about because I definitely think these are the type of critical apps that you'll see really often, and I think it's really important to have a diverse set of responses to them. But I also think that it's really important to think about the various ways in which you can kind of combat this type of argument in case you really want to figure out the best way to prep against it, or if you're trying to figure out what type of stuff you should be ready when you're trying to read an affirmative like this. And so I definitely want to talk a little bit about like what I just generally think about like what strategies are really good and how to make different strategies work. If you haven't, I would definitely watch the last video that I did, like I said, kind of just talking about the beginning steps of doing this, what your priorities should be against this argument, how you can kind of use some of its weaknesses against it, and what the kind of setup for this would look like on a case debate or a tiered framework debate. In this video, I kind of want to continue that, talking a little bit about like what criticisms are really viable against abolition and how criticisms can be read against abolition, and then trying to talk about a little bit about like what types of counterplans and dissass can be read and what are the best ways for those debates to go down. I definitely think that they're all really interesting set of debates to be had, considering how the resolution is kind of bringing to bear really important questions about like organizing tactics and like what type of like resistance towards like capitalism and violence is really the best. And so I definitely think that it's a really interesting set of videos that I'm glad I got to do if this ends up being the last one. So let's talk a little bit about abolition and the worker strike and how we should respond to these affirmatives in the context of criticisms. I think that kind of like I've said on the other side when I was talking about the best way to read these affirmatives, I definitely think for both teams it's a huge priority to have control over the framing debate. The framing debate is really important because I think that it really determines what level of solvency you're trying to refute from the affirmative. I think against a lot of these affirmatives, I think that if you're not planning on reading like for instance like the CAPK or something else that has a really specific set of kind of like alternative explanation that really separates it from the AF, like for instance, I think it's like really interesting from the fact that like when a team is reading an abolition affirmative, the negative, if reading the CAPK, could basically take the side of the resolution and really start justifying why like a worker strike, an institution that the state recognizes, is like super important. But I think that the thing that's kind of important from just like criticisms generally is what is the way in which you want to contest the solvency of the affirmative. I definitely think that it's like really important for a lot of other criticisms that are kind of outside of what I was talking about with the CAPK to really find ways to kind of like sidestep maybe the kind of like material instantiation of the tactics being the only thing that we talk about. And I think that the way that you kind of like make that justification is because of the way in which abolition is able to justify and is able to kind of like recognize or at least relate to a lot of tactics that are taken up in various types of like movement making abilities and stuff like that. Abolition is kind of like a framing or an epistemological frame for like how to do like various types of resistance, and so it can be like really easy for them to be able to access like perms and like kind of like this infinite AF conditionality. And I think that it's a lot better for you to be able to think about like what's the way can you like win that kind of way in which they're theorizing the world in which abolition arises from, and the violence that really creates the condition for the need for abolition is really a bad way of framing how we should think about violence, and shouldn't be the way for how we come to like the solutions that we think about in terms of what tactics we should choose between. And so I definitely think being able to situate the kind of like inability for the team to be able to weigh the full offense of their kind of like material solvency or whatever part of the affirmative you really think is unstrategic for your strategy against your stuff. And I think that really starts by having like a solid framework argument that really focuses the debate in on a precise part of the debate that you really want to debate out. I then think after that, the next thing that you really want to be able to do is make sure that you're able to find ways to diversify your link ground. The reason why it's important to be able to diversify your link arguments, unless you think there's like a really like strong like one kind of line of beef that you really have with the affirmative, is because I think that it's obviously A, good to give yourself options, but B, I think the more diverse answers you have to link arguments, the more diverse your offense feels when you get to other portions of the debate, such as the permutation, and when you're trying to figure out why the affirmative can't kind of be in line with the alternative. I feel like even if you're not going for like every single link argument in the 2NR, it is still really important to offer really diverse ways of kind of like differentiating the alternative and the link argument that you're going for. Sometimes, for instance, in a lot of my like later speeches, I would really go for like one link argument, but I would use the other really strong link argument to make an argument about why they don't get access to just the permutation, why it's kind of like terminal offense against like their kind of like arguments against the alternative, and why they can't kind of consume the alternative. And I think that being able to really do that at a high level is really important in order to give yourself a lot more options and flexibility when you're reading something like a criticism against an argument like this, because I definitely think that on the affirmative side, a lot of abolition teams will definitely be keeping themselves really conditional and like fluid with the type of responses that they're willing to give on the stuff that you're reading. And so I think it's really important for you to kind of like do the same in terms of giving yourself a decent amount of options. I also think that when we're trying to talk a little bit about, for instance, like what you would do with counterplans and disads, I feel like a lot of the arguments that you really want to make sure that you're keeping in the debate for counterplans and disads is if your counterplan and disad is basically a defense of the resolution as it's written, being able to contest the criticism on multiple kind of lines of ground, I think is super important. I feel like a lot of the times the things that people really want to focus in on is just being able to like really out impact win like impact comparison against like a lot of the other teams. Like a lot of teams want to be able to weigh the disad against other teams through like just standard impact comparison, and I think that although that is a winning strategy, I don't think that it's the only way to get to the ballot. I think that it's a much smarter and much easier way to get to the ballot if you can win that the way in which the disad and counterplan defends the resolution is a way of allowing it to be able to stop like things like the proximate impacts that really create the violence that is constituted by the affirmative. Then when you're able to do this impact comparison label later on about like why different forms of like terminal impacts and existential crises outweigh the affirmative, then I think you have a lot more easier time being persuasive and convincing judges, because I think it's a lot easier to do and convince so when you kind of have that defense built into being like, if we don't do this, not only does the world of the negative get worse, but the world of the affirmative gets worse because of the way in which the like workers' strike is connected to various other kinds of like movements for not only equality, but the way in which it's connected to various types of like environmental standards and other things about like how we just kind of like conduct various forms of like businesses, etc. in the world. And I think that being able to kind of like win that along with maybe some of your other like impact scenarios that kind of go at a more international level or a more existential level is really important in order to like really balance out the stuff that you want to have in the debate, and it makes it a lot easier for you to get into the types of comfortable situations that you want to get to. I think combining that with some really good arguments about why the judge should kind of be understanding the lens of how they should be viewing these kind of impacts through the lens of like materiality and the ability to solve faster, actually in terms of like the opposite of what I was saying with like the critical debates, is a lot easier I think for you to win because of the way in which people are kind of conditioned to think about like how things like policy are kind of directly translate to like political change faster than like on the ground movements. And I think being able to give a good example basis for that could only like kind of like seal that deal even easier for you, and hopefully make this a lot easier debate to win on the negative. Hopefully these videos have been helpful, and hopefully you've enjoyed the abolition series that I've been doing. And yeah, as always, thanks.